All right, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining my session. My name is Jake Burns. I am an enterprise strategist with Amazon Web Services. For those that don't know and aren't familiar with our team, we're a team comprised exclusively of customers, former customers of AWS that have all had large-scale success, leading transformations and wide-scale cloud adoption in their former role. So we're made up primarily of CTOs and CIOs and other leaders of large organizations. So we think like customers, we think like you, and it's very interesting being on this side of the table and hearing from all of you and kind of what you're going through and how similar it is how we went through. So hopefully I could share some of the lessons that I learned, both from my own personal experience and also from the over 1,000 engagements that I've done in the last 5 years in this role. So we're going to talk about specifically value, how to get value out of the cloud. And this is something, I think at this stage, most people are, convinced that cloud is a good idea. And most people are migrating to the cloud or have migrated to the cloud or building workloads in the cloud. Very different scenario than when I started about 8 years ago. But I've noticed that not everyone is getting the value that they expected, right? And I think that's a shame because it's not really that complicated to do so. I'm going to kind of go through a little bit of what I've learned throughout the years in this regard to ensure that you get the most out of the cloud. And I think we might have a little time at the end for questions, and if not, please find me afterwards. I have a little bit of time. We could talk one-on-one. So my previous life, I came from Live Nation Ticketmaster, and I led the all-in migration to AWS that we successfully completed in 2017. Now, some of you may be familiar with the cloud value realization framework, where I think there's a sustainability pillar now, but this is what we measured back when I was a customer. And we look at cost savings, productivity, resilience, and agility. I'll go through these very quickly because I think value goes far beyond these things. But just to kind of recap my experience, we were able to reduce our total cost of ownership for IT infrastructure by 48% by going all in with AWS. And again, this was early days, 2015, 16. We didn't have all the great services, and we didn't have all the great customer stories and kind of best practices back then as well. So I feel like more is achievable now. And this was also with monolithic workloads, monolithic databases, 2 ERP systems that we had never fully integrated together, so I had to migrate both of them. And a lot of works of art. They weren't necessarily born in the cloud applications. Our productivity increased quite a bit. And really, this was, just not having to focus on the undifferentiated work and being able to procure things very, very quickly, right? If you remember the old days, in the Stone Age, as I like to call it, where we used to procure servers and hardware, and it would take months, maybe years, if you had to wait a budget cycle and all of that. What we found in the cloud is that we could just procure things immediately, right? I think most of you probably are already doing this. And the great thing about that is if you don't like it, you just shut it off and stop paying for it. So things can happen much, much more quickly, and your staff can be a lot more productive. Our resilience, I'm very embarrassed about this 3.9 number, but we were able to get to more respectable 5 nines of availability. I'm not claiming that AWS infrastructure is necessarily more resilient than what you could build on premise. You could have a healthy debate either way on that. But what I will say is that customers using AWS are able to increase their resiliency and the reliability because of the tools and the functionality that they have available. And that was certainly the case for us. So there's features and there's functionality, but there's also, again, this agility concept that's going to be kind of a theme throughout this presentation, which is we try something, we don't like it, we try it again. We don't like that, we try it again. Maybe we like that, but then we think we could do better, and we try again. And we have kind of infinite chances to keep trying, keep re-architecting. I used to say on a team of 7 architects, you might have 14 different opinions on how to do something. In the old days, you kind of had to guess and choose who was right because it was a big investment. But I would just say, implement all 14. Go ahead and implement 100 different ways. Keep doing that, and let's find what the best way is. And agility, which is kind of the star of the show, right? So we talk about eliminating, reducing our app deployment cycle. That's kind of part of the story. The bigger part of the story is, again, being able to do what we want when we have the idea, test it, and maybe that same very day validate or invalidate that idea. So let's talk about first, very quickly, something very simple. What is value? The way I look at it, value has two different components to it. You can think of it as a formula. It's what you get, the benefits, divided by what you pay for what you get. So if you think about how do you increase your value, you kind of have two levers. And I want to use both of those levers. So you can increase what you get. That is, you can make the benefits that you get better and better. Or you can reduce what you pay for those same benefits. Now, most people think this is a trade-off, and I argue that point. I guess I'm a contrarian in this regard. I think you can have both of them in the cloud. And I think the cloud is very unique in that it allows you to do both at the same time. And I think that's one of the things that, as a customer, we realized very early on, which gave us those results. And this is what I want to explain today, how to get the best of those both worlds. So the first thing to remember and keep in mind is the cloud doesn't automatically create value. If you just migrate like for like to the cloud, you're just going to end up with a data center in the cloud. And so you probably end up with something roughly similar, capabilities-wise, than what you had before. And it may even cost more than what you had before. And unfortunately, this is experience of some customers because they treat their cloud like a data center. So they end up trading their servers for on-prem for instances in the cloud. Who cares, right? They end up trading their fixed costs for variable costs. But if you're treating it like a data center, it's going to be pretty much the same or perhaps more. You're just shifting from CapEx to OpEx, right? Now we can reframe this. And this is kind of, I'm going to reframe this a few times throughout this process, but servers on-prem, when you think about what does that mean, it means you're stuck with what you planned for, right? So any of us that were around before the cloud and ran IT, we know we had to think at least a year and a half, sometimes 3 years in advance, what capacity we're going to need, what capabilities we're going to need, and then go procure those things, go through that whole cycle, and then live with the results. But the problem is the business changes their mind. 3 years ago we thought we needed this, now we need this. But you're stuck with the resources and the servers, the storage, and all of those things, the technology that you were able to procure, and you have to somehow make it work. That's super inefficient, but that's how we've been doing things since the beginning of time. In the cloud, of course, it's pay for consumption, so you get as much as you need, right? But you also get as little as you need, which helps on the cost side. Fixed costs are like a kind of a nice way to say sunk costs. And sunk costs are really just a decision limiting mechanism, right? Because you pay for something and you're going to depreciate it over years, so you continue paying for it, and you never get that money back, right? Has anyone tried selling used servers? It's not an easy thing to do, right? So that money's kind of gone forever, and you're stuck with those capabilities. So those sunk costs are generally not a good thing in business. And you pay for only what you use in the cloud instead. So instead of having those sunk costs, you might decide, hey, let's spec it exactly like our data center, and then some tragedy hits, like a pandemic or fill in the blank, and we have to shrink our costs. Well, if you have those sunk costs, there's no going back. You can't go back in time. But in the cloud, you can just delete those resources, stop paying for it, pretend like it never happened. So what I'm saying here is that the cloud doesn't automatically give you value, it gives you potential value. And there's some work that needs to take place in order to tap into that value. And the more work you put into it, the more value you'll get. So let's get into some of the specifics. First, let's talk about how do we lower our costs, right? Because I found through experience, if I start talking about all the great things about the cloud, if customers in their mind are thinking, well, who cares if it's going to be more expensive, right? Let's reduce our costs first, and then we'll talk about getting more out of it. So I think this picture kind of sums up the concept, and I think perhaps most of you are aware of this, but I'm surprised how many customers I talk to, they don't really think about it this way. It's a pay-for-consumption service. When we call it a utility, it's not just a metaphor. It truly is a utility, just like your water, just like your power. Now, if you go into most organizations, and even the best-run organizations, you'll find that they're leaving the lights on at night. They're leaving the water running 24/7. Maybe they're letting all the faucets in the house, they're leaving the water running 24/7, right? So that's what you're doing when you're treating the cloud like a data center. But every drop of water that comes out of that faucet, you're paying for, right? At any time, you can turn that faucet down to half or turn it completely off and stop paying for it. So when we start thinking about costs in this way, it becomes relatively easy to reduce our costs. And it's my assertion that your cost should be lower than it was in the data center, 99% of the cases, and you should be getting more than you are today. If not, come talk to me. I'm more than happy to help you put together a strategy to fix that. So here's kind of the money slide, right? I'm going to build through this, and this is the one you want to take a picture of if you're interested in reducing costs. So I'll go through it one by one. I have this kind of three-step approach. First, you need cost transparency. Now, a lot of people try to reduce their costs in the cloud, but they're not really measuring those costs, or if they're measuring their costs, they're not measuring it with fidelity. And even if they're doing that, they're not sharing that information with the greater organization. Now, this is a problem because if you're responsible for those costs, but other folks in the organization are making decisions that affect those costs, then why are they going to cooperate with you? Unless they can see those costs, maybe their boss and their superiors can see those costs, so they can question, why is this XYZ application, which is doing almost nothing, costing us the third highest run rate of all our applications? So the answer to how do I get cooperation within the organization is, I mean, it's essentially shame them, right? But show those costs to everyone. So there's a few easy things we can do to make this happen. I'm a big fan of utilizing accounts. Now, this used to be a very, very controversial thing. Now I think it's the best practice. But back in the old days, we'd put all of our systems into one AWS account. Now, if you have great tagging, you can run reporting and get really good information on what system is costing what component is costing what, and trend that over time. But the real cheat code there, because we all know tagging is difficult, right? I've yet to see an environment where tagging is 100% accurate, and even if it is, tomorrow it won't be, right? So I'm all for tagging. But imagine you put your application in its own AWS account. You go into Cost Explorer, and you have 20 AWS accounts for 20 major applications or business units or cost centers, or however you want to separate those costs. And without having to do any additional work, you can have the total cost that that application or that business unit is responsible for. Even if they don't have to pay for it, they know that they're responsible for those costs. And unlike tagging, there's no way to argue it, right? So with tagging, you'd say, well, you tagged it wrong, so those aren't my costs. With tagging, there's costs that you can't tag. There's resources you can't tag, so those get missed, and you have to estimate them. But when you contain everything into an account, that's one grand total number. You can say, you business unit leader, this is how much you're costing us in AWS, right? So it's a very, very useful tool to use those individual accounts. And with Control Tower and all these other services that we have today, management of those accounts is not as laborious as it used to be. So utilize chargeback or showbacks. Again, we can't all do chargebacks. I didn't have the luxury of using chargebacks, so I'd use showbacks. Again, shame them, right? But at least show to the rest of the organization, or at least leadership, this information, so we can make decisions and you can get cooperation. Because these other two things that I'm going to lay out here is going to require cooperation from others in the organization. Third, make it someone's job. Give them accountability and authority, right? You got to give them both. Couple of anti-patterns that I see in organizations are people are accountable for something, but they have no authority to make the decisions, right? On the flip side of that, you have people who can make the decisions and they're not held accountable, right? Both of those situations are disastrous. One creates tyrants, the other one creates martyrs, right? You don't want either one of those. So you want the person who is responsible for something to have the power to change it, right? You have to have that parity. And again, it has to be somebody's job, because if it isn't, it won't get done in my experience. All right, next, the big thing. Remove everything unnecessary. Most people are going to say, we're running very efficiently in the cloud. And then you go look at their utilization numbers, and they're like 20% utilization. You got servers that are not being used at all. You have detached EBS volumes lying around that you're paying for. I even once saw a Redshift cluster that had been running for 6 months to the tune of $20,000 a month that was spun up for a 5-minute test, and somebody never spun it down, right? So there's degrees of this. Some of you are probably better than average at this, but everyone has room to improve in my experience in this. And I take this to an extreme, and you really have to take this to an extreme, because think about every CPU cycle, every megabyte of disk space, or gigabyte's the new megabyte, I suppose. But all of that is just money you're flushing down the drain, right? And it doesn't have to be that way. Because of the dynamic nature of the cloud, you're able to adjust as necessary, and that's what we mean when we say elasticity. So my favorite of all these is to get rid of a whole application. This is something we don't really think of. We've been trained throughout our careers in IT to kind of think of it's not really worth going in the data center and looking or going through our application portfolio and saying, let's sunset this early, let's shut this off. Because it's a sunk cost, who cares? We already paid for it, right? So we have better things to do. But in the cloud, really, there's very few things that are better to do than to find something like a whole application that's no longer needed can be shut off. And that's an extreme case. Maybe it's needed, but maybe it's not providing the value that you're expecting or the value for how much you're paying for it. So if you have that cost transparency in place, you can make that decision, or you can give it to somebody who can make the decision and say, we're paying this much for it, we're getting this much value out of it, is it worth it? If not, let's shut it off, or maybe come up with a different solution. Architecture components, these are things, like I said, storage volumes. They're always, especially block storage volumes, they're always lying around unused, especially if you have DBAs in your organization. No offense to the DBAs, but their workflow tends to be attaching and reattaching volumes a lot, and snapshots for that matter as well. So if you can find those ones that you don't need and just delete them, you save money and it really costs you nothing. Whole environments. So this is another thing, like in a dev environment that's not being used, shut it off at night, right? Or maybe it's not going to be used for a few months, just shut it off. Maybe create a CloudFormation template to pop it up when you need it, and just leave it shut off by default, those kinds of things. So the idea here is it's kind of a seek and destroy mission. Go find those, and someone has to be in charge of this, and people on your team are going to have to get good at this. This is a skill, and by the way, if you want to be that person, it's a very in-demand skill. Imagine if you could say, I went to 10 different companies, and I was able to reduce their cloud bill by 50%. That's totally realistic using this formula. So it's worth learning, it's worth getting good at. All right, so everything else that's left after you've deleted everything you can delete is to right size everything. Now, the thing here, this is scary to my IT people, myself included, because 100% utilization is pretty reckless in a data center, right? But you want to aim for 100% in the cloud, and the reason is you have that elasticity, right? And so, run your storage volumes. Look, I won't say, what I would do, 99%, but just say, let's bump it up from 70 or 80 or whatever it was on-prem to 90%, right? Let's still give us some buffer. Even without automation, you're saving 10% of your storage in that situation without even having to put any automation in place, really. It costs you nothing because you can add storage to these volumes whenever you need it. You could add storage to these volumes every second, every day if you needed to, right? So think about the possibilities there. The closer your utilization is to your capacity, the more efficient you are from a cost perspective, the lower your carbon footprint is as well, because less electricity you use, the greener you are, and it just has a whole host of benefits. So we want to aim for 100%, just shy of 100%. Now here's the key. Here's what I got wrong. I understood all this going in, and I thought this was our phase 2 of the migration, right? Phase 2 is our optimization phase. Well, it turns out that the optimization phase never ends. This is part of your operations moving forward. You're going to have this cycle of removing things and right-sizing things over and over and over again, and ideally your cost should go down as your consumption goes up. Not consumption, but as the number of workloads you move to the cloud goes up. So we got to a point where our costs were going up, we started optimizing, and our costs kind of went flat. We kept migrating workloads, and our costs actually started going down because our optimization efforts were bearing so much fruit that it was able to overcome the cost of migrating new applications. So it's kind of a way of life, right? And the sooner we accept that, the sooner we'll operate very, very efficiently in the cloud. All right, so 3 R's. I have my own 3R model. Remove, right size, repeat. That's cost optimization in a nutshell. All right, let's talk about the perhaps more interesting part, right? How do we get more out of the cloud? All right, so probably everybody's familiar with Jeff's famous 2015 letter to shareholders, but I'm going to read it here just because, and maybe dissect it a little bit, because I think he unlocks the key in this letter as to where the value of the cloud really comes from and how we can really become an innovative company by utilizing the cloud. So the famous part, failure and invention are inseparable twins. To invent, you have to experiment. If you know in advance it's going to work, it's not an experiment, right? So probably everyone's heard that before. You'd be surprised how many organizations think they're inventing, think they're experimenting, they're doing things that are really, really low risk. It's not an experiment, right? All right, so most organizations embrace the idea of invention, but they're not willing to suffer the string of failed experiments necessary to get there, right? This is key, right? So everybody wants to be Amazon, everyone wants to be Netflix, everyone wants to be these big innovative companies, right? But when you look at what it takes to do that, you have to run all of these experiments, and if those experiments are as expensive as they've been in the past, you're just not gonna do it, and you shouldn't do it. You can't blame organizations for having this approach because it's just not cost effective, right? So we have to do something about it. Outsized returns come from betting against conventional wisdom. And conventional wisdom is usually right. This is, I think, my favorite part of the whole thing, right? This sounds contradictory, right? If you want to get those big returns, if you want to hit those home runs, if you want to create the next Uber, for example, or Lyft, then you're going to have to bet against the conventional wisdom. But the conventional wisdom is there for a reason. They're right? Most of the time, they're right. But you want to find, like, the true innovation comes from finding that one little place where there may not be right or they may not be optimal and exploiting that. But you can't get there by hiring all the smart people and by trying harder and thinking harder. You can only get there by iterating over and over again on experimentation. Essentially, we're kind of replicating evolution in a sense. We're trying every possible outcome, and then the one that hits the home run, that's the one we double down on. So, given a 10% chance of 100 times payoff, you should take that bet every time, right? That sounds counterintuitive as well. You're going to be wrong most of the time, but it's the only way that you can get those big outcomes. So, makes an analogy to baseball, where you can only get 4 runs in a home run in baseball, but in business you can get the equivalent of 1,000 runs, and I think even more, right? So the payoff is huge if you're able to do this, right? So how do we do that? The problem is, we know that experimentation leads to innovation, right? We've seen this time and time again. If you experiment more, you're more likely to find those innovative ideas. Even if you have the smartest people in the world, even if you're doing everything else right, the more iterations, the higher the chances, just simple math. Most experiments fail, and this failure is expensive, and that's why we don't do it. That's the problem. So what's the solution? Well, okay, let's reframe this one more time. So, I argue that the cloud, the big superpower of the cloud, and I know this is a very overused word, it's agility, right? I'm sure you're sick of hearing about agility, right? But it really is the key to all of this. The organizations that are getting outsized value from the cloud are taking advantage of the agility that the cloud gives them. They're operating in a very different way than they were beforehand, and that their competitors are if they're not doing it this way, even if they're in the cloud. So if we reframe this again, what we have in the data centers, we're stuck with what we have. We're stuck with the decisions that we made in the past, right? Looking at capabilities now. My capability is what I could foresee a year ago. Whereas in the cloud, you have the freedom to experiment, change your mind as much as possible, try many different things, and that's a good thing. What we pay is, again, a high cost for one shot, right? You get one at bat, you better get it right. What you pay in the cloud is much less to be able to get shots over and over and over again and try as much as possible. So when you're operating in this way, it becomes super worth it, and this is how businesses actually get transformed by utilizing the cloud. It's not about reducing their costs, which is nice, you should get that also. It's not about, we don't have to manage a data center anymore, which again is nice. Nobody wants to manage data centers. But it's really about having that ability, that business ability, to take as many shots as you need and not have to pay huge costs for the failed ones, which are going to be the most of them. So agility reduces the cost of failure, and that's the key. In order to get to that innovation, we need to experiment, and in order to experiment, we need to try many, many things. We can only do that if the cost of failure is low. The cost of failure becomes low when we have the agility from the cloud, when we implement cloud in a way that's kind of not like a data center. So how does it work? In the past, we had to plan and guess, essentially, right? If we're being honest, that's what we did. I ran IT organizations throughout my career, and we're guessing all the time, right? We're guessing how much things would cost, we guess how much capacity we needed, and you're almost never right. With a pay-for-consumption, you don't need to do that. So I argue, eliminate almost all planning. Eliminate almost all capacity planning, right, once you're in the cloud, because it's kind of wasted time. Why would you want to plan for something that you can change at a moment's notice, right? So we shift from putting our effort into trying to predict the future. Instead, we put our effort into becoming as agile as possible so it doesn't matter what the future is, right? And we can adjust accordingly no matter what happens. Before, we had the capabilities we chose to invest in. We had to have that foresight. But in the cloud, you have access to the latest technology. And by the way, you migrate, and then a month later, you get a new capability, right? So you get kind of grandfathered in, right? We're going to announce a lot of new features this year. And if you're in AWS, you don't need to necessarily sign up for those features or necessarily develop those features or anything like that. You just get them just by being there. So you're investing in something that's evolving over time, and that hopefully will be best of breed at every moment in time. So you don't have to guess. You're likely to have the technology you need if you're in the cloud. And then again, managing the undifferentiated heavy lifting. That is a big burden for a lot of organizations and a big risk for a lot of organizations. But the big thing that it does is it takes your focus away from what you're trying to do. The business is trying to innovate and serve customers. IT shops are trying to keep their systems running, keep them performant, keep them secure. These are the things that we should be focusing on, not racking and stacking servers and all of those other things, and like trying to determine which server we need and trying to buy it. So here's kind of, in one sentence, kind of how I think about it. There's two ways you can play any game. You can play the game of needing to get it right the first time, which is the data center game. But this is true in a lot of things. We want to play the game where we only need to be right once. So I'm going to give a couple examples of this. So kind of will make a little bit more sense. But imagine, if you will, that you're playing under a set of rules. It could be any game, right? It could be chess, could be anything, right? You're playing this business, you're playing this game, and you only need to be right once, right? You could try 100 times, 1,000 times, 10,000 times. You get to the right answer once, you win. And your competitor has one shot. They got a plan, they could put all this effort into planning, and they're probably going to be wrong, right? So it's obvious which camp we want to be in. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is a fun sport. Here's an example from my life. I'm unfortunately pinned right here, and guy on top is winning. But I would argue he's playing a game where he has to get it right the first time. If he makes one mistake, I escape. I may win the match. I can try as many times, as much time as I have, to try different escapes. First one fails, second one fails, third one fails. In this sample, I think I failed 20 times. Nobody remembers those 20 times I failed because eventually I found something that worked and I got out. He got it wrong once, I got it right once, but I got to try 20 more times than he did, right? So now, in this example, if I only had 5 seconds, that really wouldn't have worked very well. So having more time allowed me to try those many things. In business, we're generally not under those time constraints, and the faster that we move, the more of those at-bats we can get, right? So we want to go as fast as possible, experiment as fast as possible, get to that right thing once, and hopefully go up against people who are playing a different set of rules. There's another example, and this is kind of the one that I famously use, with digital photography, right? So you look at the cover of, this is obviously AI generated, but you could think of a magazine that looks like that. There's a few of them. And they have this great photograph on the cover, right? It's amazing. And the photographer is such a genius for making that photo, and it probably is. But, back in the day, this was a very, very difficult process. So if anyone who's into photography, you probably remember Ansel Adams, right? He was playing a game where he had to get it right the first time. He had this camera, took one piece of film, had to get on his mule and go up a hill and find that perfect shot. And he would spend days setting up these shots, right? Because he had to get it right. He would come back, he would develop it, and see the result. This could be a 2, 3 week, 4 week, 6-month cycle to even know if that shot worked. So he better get that right the first time, because if not, he's going to be at this for 1,000 years trying to get that shot, right? Well, compare that today. I think this might be the best analogy of what cloud does for IT. The digital camera changed the rules. Anyone who's ever seen a professional photographer or done digital photography, especially in sports photography, the best strategy is not to just sit there and wait for that perfect shot and click the shutter. You just hold down that shutter button, right? Put a big memory card in there and just spray and pray, right? Then you go back and you look at all these pictures, right? And you find the best one out of all of them. You take that best one and then put that in Photoshop, put that in Lightroom, and tweak that, invest in that photo. and you show that to the world, and you look like a genius. And again, maybe you are a genius, but a lot of it is just a numbers game, right? So we should be doing the same thing with our applications, right? If we're developing applications that are customer-facing, this works. If we're developing architectures for our back-end IT systems, this works. The same pattern works for everything that we do in the cloud. We want to cheaply and quickly try as many different things. Let's not try to predict what's going to be best. Let's find out what's going to be best by actually doing it. Throw away all those things that didn't work, or at least throw away all those things that weren't the best, or the best 3, or whatever you decide, and then invest all your time and energy in those ones that were the best, whether it be the right architecture, the next killer app, or the next photograph for the cover of a magazine, right? And then you just show that to the world. Again, look like a genius. You'll get there much more quickly, you'll get much better results, and this is what the cloud allows you to do. All right, so I think I blew through this pretty quickly, but I'm gonna give you some tangible advice based on what I've learned on how to get there. So first is to build a high-performing cloud team. I have a whole other presentation on this, on the mechanics of this, but I'll give you the highlights. What I've observed is the success of cloud adoption within enterprises and the success of a transformation with enterprises is directly proportional to the motivation and the skill and the opportunity to use that skill that your employees have within that organization. It's not the consultants that come in, it's not the partner that you have, although those are great resources to use in very specific ways, but it's really about getting compound interest in investing in your team. And if you do that, they will solve most of these problems for you. So if there's one thing that correlates most with success, in my experience, it's how much you're investing in your team. So give them training, all that kind of stuff. Second, well, actually, this is kind of how you do that. Get buy-in from them. So a lot of folks, and I'd say this is less true today than it was before, they see cloud as a threat, right? A threat to my career. Why would I engineer myself out of a job? I've heard that many, many times. So they need to have 3 things to have buy-in. And this is true for employees, this is true for stakeholders, this is true when you're managing up as well, when you're building a business case. Is, first of all, why are we doing this, right? So if we say we're moving to the cloud because the cloud is hype, the cloud is hot right now, or we want to save money, it's not really that compelling. It doesn't really make you want to come to work every day and like give it your all. But what is your business doing? Focus on that and make that your message, right? So for us at Live Nation, it was we're going to make the fan experience the best in the world class, right? For another organization I work with, we're going to make the roads safer. We're going to reduce accidents on the road. Think about like what your employees will go back and talk about when they get together during the holidays. And someone asks, what have you been doing at work, right? Are they going to say, I've been racking and stacking servers? And like, what does that mean, right? Are they going to say, well, we're migrating to the cloud? Okay, it's a little better, but I don't know, your parents might not know what the cloud is, right? But if they say, we're revolutionizing the retail experience, right? We're creating stores where people can just walk out instead of having to see a cashier, things like that, right? That's what you're really doing. So communicating that message to them so they'll care. Second is how. Share your plans. One of the biggest mistakes I see leaders make is they have a plan and they don't communicate it transparently to their team. And what ends up happening is that they have no confidence, right? It's like, I don't know how we're going to do this. I don't see how we're going to get to the finish line, so I don't believe we're going to get to the finish line. So being super transparent about those plans, let them provide feedback. It's not a Homer's car type situation, if you remember that old Simpsons reference, where everybody gets a say, and it ends up being something, that's, incoherent. But your plan will get better the more feedback you get, right? And the more importantly, they will understand how you're going to get there, and nobody wants to be a part of a failed project. Everyone wants to be a part of a successful project. So they have to be convinced that it's going to be successful for them to give it their all. And then thirdly, more importantly, perhaps, is what's in it for them, right? So my answer to what about my job security is your job security is already gone. The world is moving, the world is evolving, right? Here's your opportunity to become a part of this evolution, right? And so if you learn these skills, if you take advantage of all of these things that we're giving you, the training, the certification, the hands-on experience, which you absolutely should be giving to everybody in your organization, then I'm going to be fighting to keep you. You're not going to be fighting to keep your job. You're going to be so valuable to this organization and to the marketplace. And the same is true for stakeholders within the organization. Answer those 3 questions. Why we're doing it, how we're doing it, and what's in it for them. Now, outsourcing, right? I'm not against outsourcing. I'm just against how most people do outsourcing. So I think outsourcing should be used in 2 ways primarily, based on my experience. One is you bring in low-cost, temporary basis workers to kind of pick up the slack. Do all the things your teams don't want to do. Keep the lights on, that sort of thing, right? And communicate that to them and say, look, I'm bringing these folks in, not to replace you, but to do all this work you don't want to do, so you can learn how to use AWS, how you can build in the cloud and do all of that, right? The second is to bring in experts. Bring in experts on a temporary basis, and again, over-communicate that it's temporary, because this could be seen as a threat. You can learn from them. They're not going to build this. They're just going to show you how they did it. They might look over your shoulder a little bit, give you their advice. You're going to learn from their experience. Then they're going to leave. We're going to kick them out. That's a very important part to communicate, right? So when you frame outsourcing that way, it tends to bring morale up, as well as increase the success of your operations. What you don't want to do is bring in other folks to build it. Have them leave, take all that knowledge with them, and kill morale of your team in the process, right? So have the people you outsource do the boring work or the teaching, but not the actual building of your systems. Utilize training. In my case, I didn't hire anyone new. I mean, this was my choice. I kind of glossed over my story, but I had a mandate from the CEO to go all in 12 months, and 0 budget, 0 headcount. So I was kind of forced with the team that I had to utilize them. But that was a blessing in disguise, because it forced me to learn how to develop that team, right? So we utilized AWS training and certification. In fact, I'll tell you, one of the things we did that, if you can get away with it, I highly, highly recommend, is to do the training and a migration at the same time, or modernization at the same time. It's a lot to ask of your team, but it's by far the way that I found teams learn the fastest, because they need to be, when they're learning something, it has to be tied to something that's super important to them, right? So we've already described why we're doing this, so hopefully that's in their mind. And timing has to be relevant, right? Because if you do the training too quickly, too soon, then that skills are going to atrophy by the time they need to use it. And if you do it too late, well then they've already made a bunch of mistakes, now they got to go back and fix it. So you do it immediately before the work's going to be done, or while the work's being done. And for me personally, I don't know if this is still the case, this is several years removed, but I was able to kind of abuse the trainers a bit. And we were migrating, so we'd come into training and they put the kind of day's agenda up on the board in the lab and say, instead of the lab, could we just talk about what we tried yesterday that didn't work, right? And we kind of got free consulting out of the trainers. And the AWS trainers are very, very, very skilled. So take advantage of that if you can, if they're still willing to do that. Create a meritocracy. Here's another word, just like agility, that's overused, but so important. What this means is, regardless of your current status in the organization, regardless of your seniority or lack thereof, there's a clear set of rules that we've agreed upon in order to get access to AWS, get access to work on the project. In my particular case, I'll tell you a very quick story. I opened up access to the cloud team, which essentially was the infrastructure team that I rebranded as cloud. And I opened that up to everyone in the organization in IT who was willing to participate in this. In the beginning, not many people wanted to do it. It was kind of unproven at the point, and it wasn't certain that it would be successful. It looked like an impossible situation, given the constraints we were under. 2 people that came onto the team from other parts of IT. One was a help desk manager, who had no experience with infrastructure whatsoever. At some point, I realized that I could run a report in AWS, like halfway through the migration. And it would show me who built what. And number 1 person, a team of like 30 people, was like 60%, 70%, which blew my mind, but I wasn't surprised that it was him. Second place blew my mind, though. I don't know, it was like 15% or something crazy, and the rest was like a long tail. And it was this help desk person who'd been sitting in the corner. I didn't even know he was working, to be honest. I thought he was still learning, and he was just building systems. It turns out he'd been waiting his entire career for a shot like this, and he just ran with it. He got the training, he got the certifications, he got access to environments, and he just started building. And if I didn't run the report, I would have never knew. He was the second most productive person on the team. So because I had this meritocratic system in place where the people who wanted to contribute and were able to contribute had that opportunity, I learned that there were certain people who could be very productive that I never would have found, right? And the opposite could also be true. Just because someone's senior level doesn't mean that they're going to necessarily buy into this and be able to be effective, be able to change and adapt. It's a very different skill set than running on-prem systems. The second example was a data center operator. So we're getting rid of our data centers. So that was kind of a dead-end job at that point. Now, he ended up building systems in AWS. He became a junior architect and was, went from kind of a dead-end job to something that was very exciting, right? And as far as I know, he's still doing that and on a great career trajectory. So you'd be surprised how much support you'll get if you open it up to everybody. And here's the thing. For people to care, there has to be this perception of fairness, right? And I say perception very specifically. It should be fair, but for them to care, they have to perceive it to be fair. And setting up a system like this creates that perception of fairness. It actually, I would argue, creates fairness also, but it's kind of like what I put in is what I'll get out. The opportunities that I have are the opportunities that I take advantage of. And if you can create that with the organization, even if it's a small team and not very well-funded team, you can achieve great things, like going all in 17 months without spending any money. And lastly, the last point, and this is important, and this is not something I've talked about until recently, but you could do all of these things, and if the rest of the organization does not demand more from IT and its technology teams, then you'll be no better off than you were in a data center from a business perspective. You may be running servers more efficiently, you may be saving money, but you're not going to be inventing the next big thing. So if, for example, if the business thinks, we didn't put this in the budget last year, so we got to wait another year before we try it. They don't know that we're in this pay-for-consumption model where an experiment is a rounding error, right? So there's this education process that has to happen once you're in the cloud and once your folks are trained and understand what the cloud is. As leaders, we have to go out to the rest of the non-technical teams within the organization, explain to them, or at the very least, ask them to challenge us. Say, I know it's been like this forever. I know you always run out of disk space on the storage array, and I say, pound sand, right? Come next year when you have budget. I can't afford to, or find something to delete. Well, I want you now to just come to me and tell me what you need. And I'll tell you what it's going to cost, right? That's the new way of doing things. And so this ended up being much more important than I initially imagined and much more impactful. And I think it's absolutely critical to success in the cloud because if they're not challenging you, you're going to have all these capabilities, but they're going to be untapped capabilities. All right, so thank you, everyone.